On the line, we have Tim Wise. Tim Wise first got to my attention through one of the best explanations of connecting the current political dynamic to the racist origins and present of our country that I've ever seen, and help set a tone for white allies as well as anyone I have seen. It's someone I've learned from and try to learn from more. I've never had a chance to talk to him before. Honored to have a chance to talk to him now. He had a thread that a bunch of people paid attention to, and I had multiple people ask me, did you see it? Did you see it? And I said, yeah, I saw it. And really glad to have the chance to ask him about that, where he essentially took lessons from running against David Duke or helping the campaign to defeat David Duke, and thinking about how those lessons can be, might be, should be translated to the campaign against Donald Trump. On the line right now, we have Tim Wise. Good to talk to you, sir.
Good to talk to you. Thanks.
Give us the background on the David Duke campaign, and then let's talk about what you learned from it.
Sure. So, a lot of people don't really remember this, but it's been almost 30 years. David Duke, former leader of the largest Ku Klux Klan group in the U.S., really a white supremacist and modern Nazi for all of his adult life, was running for the United States Senate in Louisiana in 1990 and then governor in 91. He had already been elected to the Louisiana State House in an election in 1989. And there were several of us at the time. There was an organization formed specifically for the purpose of defeating him, a PAC that was not going to work with any existing candidate, but the whole purpose of which was really to defeat Duke in that Senate race at first, and then later the governor's race. And I was hired as the campus coordinator, later became associate director of that group. And at the time, what Duke was doing was taking sort of the dog whistle racism that had really been quite common in American politics, at least since Wallace and Nixon, if not quite a bit earlier than that, and beginning to really bullhorn that racism, not playing nearly as many games, still trying to cover up his intent, but doing so in a way that was only, pretty transparent.
Not just saying
trying to do, blaming.
Not just saying states' rights.
Yeah, no. It was much more blatant. He was, he was saying people's taxes are too high because we're spending all this money on those people for welfare, or the reason you don't have a job is because a black person took it because of affirmative action, or an immigrant took it. The reason you're afraid to go out at night is because of black criminals. I mean, he was much more blatant. And he was using this politics of prejudice and racial scapegoating to lure white voters in Louisiana to him. And it worked in a lot of ways. I mean, he got in that U.S. Senate race 44% of the vote overall, 60% of the white vote. In the governor's race the next year, he got 39% of the total, 55% of the white vote. So in both elections, the majority of white people ratified a guy who they knew was a Nazi. It wasn't a mystery. It's not that they didn't know. They knew and they did not care. And as I've looked at Trump, I realize, obviously, Donald Trump is not the same as David Duke. I realize there are very serious distinctions. David Duke is actually a National Socialist, and I don't believe Donald Trump is. But they are both tapping into the same vein of white racial resentment and using a politics of prejudice and racial scapegoating to catapult themselves to power. In the case of Donald Trump, I don't think that we have applied some of those lessons that a few of us, at least in Louisiana, learned in 90 and 91 in figuring out how to respond to him. And I was worried when I posted the 34-tweet Twitter thread a week ago that the current sort of Democratic Party approach and the candidates' approach is to treat this almost like any other campaign. Here are our wonderful policy ideas. Here's what we're going to do on healthcare. Here's what we're going to do to make college affordable. And the problem is we're talking about Trump and Trumpism. Trumpism is not a movement that came to power on the basis of ideas and logic and people sitting down and looking at position papers and going, oh, I think I like this better than this. Fascism is not a fact-based movement. It is an emotion-driven movement. And to bring spreadsheets to a gunfight, which is what I think the Democrats are doing, is not going to drive the base to the polls, and it is certainly not going to get those reasonable moderates, independents, and Republicans to vote against Trump. So I think that there's a real danger here that hasn't been learned from the Duke years.
And the case, a portion of the case you made was every time we focus our critique on some other thing, it almost is like we make equivalent his, you didn't use his example, but his weave comb-over hairstyle with his racism. If we just pile on a set of critiques, then it seems like, well, it's just all a synonym for we don't like this guy, rather than trying to focus the nation on the racism of the man and the racism of his movement. And we have to put the focus there and rather than distract ourselves with other stuff.
Right. And everyone has said from the beginning, we don't want to normalize Trump. Well, what could be more normalizing than to think you're going to beat him with your health care plan? I mean, that's exactly the way you would run against Ted Cruz. It's the same way you would run against Jeb Bush. It's the same way you would run against any Republican. That's normalizing him. And with Duke, we learned this the hard way. You know, I was involved in both the Senate race and the governor's race working against him. And in the Senate race, I'll be perfectly honest, and I talked about this in the thread in Washington Post, and I've talked about it all week. There were consultants, mainstream Democratic Party consultants, as well as conservatives within our own coalition who were very nervous about talking about Duke's politics of modern racism. They didn't mind, obviously, talking about the Klan and his Nazi connections, but they didn't want us to talk about his racial scapegoating, his modern politics, out of fear that that would provoke a backlash on the part of white voters who agreed with those politics. And so in the Senate race, they were telling us, look, you don't want to talk about that. What you should talk about is the fact that Duke paid his taxes late, or, you know, the fact that Duke skipped out of service in Vietnam, or the fact that Duke wrote a sex manual under a female pseudonym, which he actually did do, which is weird. I don't want to talk about that. But in any event, like, they told us, you got to talk about these other character things. And unfortunately, you know, they had a lot of clout. They had the polling that made it seem like that was a good strategy. And we tried it. And I think it muddled the debate, because if you're talking about this guy's a Nazi, oh, and by the way, he paid his taxes late, people hear that and go, wait, what? If he's a Nazi, why don't you just sort of stick on Nazi? It seems like you're throwing everything out there.
Understood.
And I think with Trump, we do the same thing. Oh, it's Russia. Oh, it's the fact that he's a grifter. Oh, it's the fact that he's got his hands in Saudi Arabia and all these places making money. Oh, and it's Jared, and it's Ivanka, and it's, you know, and at some point, people hear that and go, well, is this a moral thing, or do you just not like the guy? And I think if you have someone whose entire politic is about scapegoating, racism, bigotry, xenophobia, you know, religious bigotry, you have to stay on that. It is a moral issue. Trumpism is an existential threat to the country.
We've got 1 minute, and my question is very long. And where I agree is in one of the pieces of your thread, you say we got to put the focus not just on David Duke or not just on Donald Trump, but the focus on us and how we need to, this is not who we are as a nation. This is not who we want to be. Our identity can't merely be our racial identity. It has to be our compassion identity, our loving identity, our identity to try to make the world a little bit better. Here is my quibble. So most of it I just read nodding, but here is what I still wrestle with, is that Donald Trump, and you already embedded it in your introductory remarks, that Donald Trump does not have the credential of being a former Grand Dragon of the KKK. And you know, he was not, David Duke was not just Robert Byrd, who was a minor KKK member as a younger man. He's not just a Food Network person who said the N-word. He had this credential. There is a debate right now about whether or not Donald Trump is racist. I think it's a debate kind of like climate change is a debate. I think it's a debate kind of like smoking causes cancer was in the 1970s. But nonetheless, much of the argument is not assumed Donald Trump is racist. Most of the response is no, he's not. And I wonder if that changes strategic analysis. We got a few seconds. Last word for you.
It doesn't change it, because whether or not one believes Donald Trump is a racist, we ought to be able to look at how he's campaigning and what he is using as a tool. He is performing racism. And that makes it important.